David Pluviose, and welcome to In the Margins. Today we have as our guest Dr. Thomas Parham, the president of California State University, Dominguez Hills. Dr. P, welcome. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us here for In the Margins.
My pleasure to join you, and it's a pleasure to be here, and particularly around diverse issues. You know, I've been a longtime fan of Cox and Matthews forever. So whatever I can do to support this endeavor, I certainly want to be, and I'm honored to be here with you.
Thank you so very much. You know, I want to start off. There have been a number of Black student success initiatives that you have led, that you've been a part of. But I was wondering if you could start off talking a little bit about your background and journey to CSU Dominguez Hills. I just want you to talk a little bit about yourself a little bit.
My journey. So grew up in Los Angeles, educated in California, received my bachelor's degree at the University of California at Irvine, where I had an opportunity there to be mentored. My Jegna there was the great Dr. Joseph L. White, the contemporary father of the Black psychology movement. So how blessed was I to be mentored by him. Did my graduate work in the Midwest at Washington University in St. Louis, and then Southern Illinois University in Carbondale in the psych department there, where I received my PhD in counseling psych. And then came back to California to do my internship. Psychologists do internship like physicians do residency. So I was back doing it then, and then I was out on the job market. And as I was looking for opportunities, one of the folk that came looking for me was the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So I started my career as an Ivy League professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Ironically, they tell me the first African-American academic psychologist the University of Pennsylvania ever hired in its 200-some-year history after it was founded by Ben Franklin. Wow. I never bothered to verify whether or not that was true or not. That's what people told me when I got there, but was honored to be in this space, loved the position, loved the institution. It was great. Was recruited to come back to California in 1985 to an administrative post, but also as a joint appointment as an adjunct faculty member at Irvine. And I thought I'd stay 5 years, David, and maybe go back to full-time faculty after that, because I had a joint clinical appointment and doing my scholarship and research, which I'm very keen on writing. But 33 years later, I was still at the University of California, Irvine. And Irvine said, well, why would you go anyplace else when you can do anything you want to do here? So I taught every year but two, did my clinical work, did my consulting. It gave me time to do my research and scholarships. So when I write these texts on African psychology, multicultural counseling, or just try to help define and frame the discourse, I was able to do all that from that platform at Irvine. And then in 2018, was approached with an opportunity to apply for a position as a university president in the California State University. Ironically, this role that I'm in now as president is something I never planned on doing in my career. You can find nobody in my background that'll tell you Parham ever aspired to be a university president. I didn't. But it's a fulfillment of a prophetic voice of my, mentor, Dr. White, who said, young man, if you produce excellence, excellence will bring you opportunity. And the opportunity to be university president is, one of the big honors of my life. And particularly to lead this institution that has such a rich social justice history and diversity on the campus. And so I've been here since 2018, serving as their chief executive and trying to help define and frame the discourse on what higher education ought to consider and be about in my work. So that's a little bit about my journey.
You reference, of course, probably a number of firsts in your career. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit, in our magazine and, of course, our newsletters, we've written quite a bit about what institutions are doing, can do, should do with regards to, for instance, boosting the pipeline to the professoriate for African-American scholars, whether institutions should focus more on growing their own, right? Looking at their own graduate student cohort as potential future faculty members. But as of course, you know, there is this sense that, once you graduate from institution, you need to go somewhere else, right? And so you have that kind of sense. I was wondering if you could talk about this issue just a little bit with regards to, if we talk about Black faculty in particular, what were some of the ingredients to your success being at predominantly majority institutions that you could point to say, hey, these are some of the things that this institution did to support me on my own journey?
That's an interesting question. Without being too long-winded, I go back, I think, to the seeds that were planted again by Joseph White, who mentored and trained me. And Joe taught me several fundamental lessons, but there were three that come to mind in answer to this question. One, he said the key to mental health, particularly for a young Black man, is always having a broad range of choices and options. So I want you to have multiple options of what you do. He said, produce excellence, and excellence will bring you opportunity. He says, you don't have to tell nobody how smart and brilliant you are. Opportunities will just come if you just continue to produce excellence. That's your goal. And then one of the most profound lessons he taught me, actually two more, he said, whenever you go into an environment, you should engage in a level of what we call sequential analysis. You should always assess what an environment will tolerate so that you know how far to A, push the boundaries, and B, what kind of sacrifice you're going to need to endure in order to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve in that institution. But then the most profound lesson he taught me that I still teach, people that I mentor today, is that you should never seek validation from your oppressor. So the problem was never that people have a negative opinion about Black folk or women or whether you're LGBT or whatever it is. The problem is you give a darn about what they think in the first place. And it's that kind of confidence and agency that allowed me to really navigate that space. But oftentimes what happens now related to the professoriate is that oftentimes you have to make sure that you have a fit. Most systems in America have a three-tiered system of education and higher education that's public. You have your top research one universities, you have your regional comprehensives, and then you have your community colleges. So people apply for jobs just because they're jobs and opportunities, but sometimes don't figure whether they're a good fit for that. If you're going to University of Pennsylvania or University of California, which are big research one institutions, you need to be prepared to write and produce scholarship and publish or perish. That's literally that mindset. Mm-hmm. But when you think about the activities of teaching, research, and public service, research is always going to be at the top of that list because that's where research ones, make the grade. If you're in a regional comprehensive, you got to do some scholarship and research, but you're doing mostly teaching there. And if you're in community colleges, it's almost all teaching without requirements to do a lot of scholarship and research. So first is finding out whether or not you're a good fit. So when I went to grad school with a mindset that my mentor taught me about, make sure he said, I'm not sending you to grad school in psychology to be just clinically good.
Yep.
That I want you to be clinically good, academic instruction good, research good, and then you'll come along to do the consulting you'll be able to do, and then you'll do the administration. So if you look at my career, starting off at the University of Pennsylvania, I was an academician, so I'm teaching in the classroom, undergraduate and graduate students. I was a clinician because I had a joint appointment in the counseling center. I was a scholar and researcher, so I'm doing and writing because I like to write. Interesting story about that too, I'll get to in a second. But also then consulting came along, and then I'm doing a little bit of administration. So those 5 things were part of my, regular portfolio. But in order for me to stay and be successful at a place like Penn, I had to be able to publish and produce. Mm-hmm. If you're not good at writing, it doesn't come easy to you, if you struggle with it, or if you're not publishing in some of the best journals, it's going to be hard to stay in places like that. But it still doesn't mean that you don't have a place in academia. It just means you have to find a place that's a good fit for what the assets and skills are you bring into that space. Mm-hmm. Just happen to love to write, and I'm decent with statistical analysis, et cetera. So the fact that you can, calculate ANOVAs or multiple regressions or something, that just is part of what we do. But for a lot of folk, I think they find it a challenge. So again, you have to be able to navigate that space. But also, I think in the pipeline, there is oftentimes, I think, implicit bias that exists in institutions of higher education, and particularly departments, that even though you may have a chief executive like me as a president who says, we care about this thing we call diversity, that mindset, that value doesn't always penetrate down into the level of departments and other places and staffs who are actually making the hiring decisions to carry out those values that you say the institution is really committed to. So part of what we've got to be able to do is continue to interrogate and push up against what I call those stones of stagnation and rocks of resignation that keep people from being the diverse and inclusive and socially justice minded kind of departments and institutions that they say they want to be, but they can't somehow find a way to close the gap between the aspirational self and, the real self that is falling far short of that particular goal. When I came back to Irvine, I wasn't on tenure track any longer, but I still continued to publish. Partly because in my mind, I may go back to academia and I'll be in Research One institutions probably. And the first thing they're going to do is turn to page 8 on my Vita and go, what have you published lately? So I kept my scholarship up, but also kept it up, true story, because I remember my mama when growing up, she said, son, you should never criticize anything unless you're willing to put something better in this place. I've been so critical about literature, particularly the psychological literature, as it frames and characterizes people of African descent, that I figured that I shouldn't just critique it, but I think I can put something better in this place, which is why I write so much. So most of what I've written, and I've not written a whole bunch, I only have, I think, 6, 7 books and probably, 50, 55 journal articles and book chapters and things. But with that career being mostly an administrator, part of what I want to do is be in a position to define and frame the narrative on what people all are thinking about. I need to dislodge people from those comfortable categories of intellectual, emotional, and behavioral apathy that have them thinking about life and people and circumstance in ways in which they've always thought about it, rather than breaking out of that and saying, we can think about this in a different way, particularly when it comes to hiring African-American and other minority professors who help to diversify not only the curriculum, but the institution's values and goals to create more of a universal education that our students receive.
I want to talk a little bit with you about mental health when it comes to Black students in particular. The last few years, have been, particularly turbulent for so many, especially, of course, as in African American and other minority communities. The pandemic has taken a heavy toll. Many people have lost numerous family members, especially the Black community. We know that toll was disproportionately high when it came to severe illness and death with regards to this pandemic. We also know, we look at this flashpoint of systemic racism. Of course, this is nothing new in terms of what's been happening with police brutality and other issues that specifically affect African Americans. But at least when it came, comes to the nation, there seemed to have been a greater focus on that. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about mental health when it comes to Black students. Many institutions like yours and others, of course, are focused on what they can do with regards to recruitment, retention, persistence for males as a whole, because many have said, all right, there's actually a male issue, but Black males in particular. And there are some conferences, Black, Brown, and College Bound, and others I'm sure that you've seen out there that really kind of hone in on what institutions can do to better support Black students in particular through the higher education journey, getting them to graduation and beyond. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about mental health when it comes to Black students and what you have done, of course, at Dominguez Hills and other institutions should do to better support specifically, I would say, Black male students who they hope to see graduate at higher numbers.
Complex question, but let me see if we can't dissect it a little bit and break it down. So let me start with mental health. It's important, first of all, when you talk about Black mental health, to remember that it is difficult sometimes to define mental health for African descent people if you're using conceptual templates that are developed out of European American norms as the kind of guidepost, if you will, for looking at how mental illness manifests itself, or even how to support mental health. It's like, how do you promote mental health in an African-American student if you have no idea about what constitutes mental health for African people? Because you can't assume that it's the same and it's universal for everybody. There are cultural traditions and nuances, I think, that make it a little different. So one, you have to have an acute awareness about what that represents. And particularly, how do you create, the human condition functions in relationship to its environment, and an environment that should be supportive and affirming versus one that is very toxic and negative, et cetera, where people are feeling kind of put out, put down, and like somehow they don't exist. So you want to avoid creating conditions where people feel more marginalized in the institutions that they're in. You don't want them to feel and be exposed to what I would call the cultural sterility that is so pronounced in institutions. You don't want them exposed to places in the classroom where people feel that sense of microaggression, micro assault, micro invalidation that is part and parcel of a lot of institutions of higher education around the country. And so we wonder why students come out feeling stressed, put out, angry, guilty, anxiety provoked, et cetera, because the environments that they're in don't provide that support and affirmation that the human condition requires in order just to go about its business and be self-actualized. So recognizing that part of what we want to do is, one, have mental health resources in place, but also recognize that this individual, who I consider to be a seed of divinely inspired possibility, and that if we can nurture that individual in its proper context, they'll grow into the fullest expression of all they're supposed to become. And so our campuses, my campus, is a soil into which that seed of divinely inspired possibility is placed. And my job is to water it with the drops of intellectual enrichment, is to sprinkle it with the nutrients, the miracle grow, if you will, that helps them be socialized in terms of the values and indoctrination we want folk to have. It's to take the tools and till the soil to take the weeds of social distraction out of their life. And then give them just enough sunlight of affirmation and just enough shade of critique. And then you stand back and just watch them grow and flower into the fullest expression of all they're supposed to become. If we had that mindset about our students, then we think about cultivating, right, the genius that is within them in ways in which that allow them to feel more supportive and affirmed. I mean, when I'm at Penn and I'm at University of California, Irvine, who are Research One universities, some of the best privates and publics in the nation, and for sure in everything. But they're sitting on students who are 4.3 GPAs and touting their success as if, aren't we wonderful because we only admit with our selectivity ratios the top 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 10% of people.
Yes.
I played that game. I was part of that system. I managed some of that. But at this point in my career, David, what I want to be a part of is recognizing that talent is equally distributed, not only across races, but there's a lot more talent besides just the high end of the normal curve. And being a scholar all my life, I can take a 4.0 student and keep him or her 4.0. That's easy. What I want at this point in my life, in terms of cultivating mental health, is to find that 2.5 student who could be a 3.0, a 3.0 who could be a 3.5, a 3.5 who could be a 3.7, and go on to be a psychologist or a physician or attorney or something else, or a publisher with diverse issues in higher education. If we just cultivate and help to really push that along. And so we're trying to put those things in place that, one, help them know that they belong, that help them see that within the realm of possibility that it is possible for you to achieve a college education, to keep it affordable, and for you to master the intricacies of all the curriculum and the co-curricular learning opportunities that are on a university campus, and help you then increase your trajectory once you both persist and graduate so that you're now out into the world thriving. After all, that's what creates a mentally healthy people, in that space. And so we try to provide that even as we have psychological services that are invested in doing that. Now, it is true that men are very underrepresented in lots of higher education institutions. My campus, as an example, has 89% students of color on it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a very diverse campus, probably one of the most diverse in the nation. We've got 66% Latinx kids. That's probably second most in the whole state of California. We have 12% African-American kids, maybe a little less, 11.5. That's the largest percentage of Black students of any public university in the entire state of California. We've got maybe 7.5% Asian American, 6% Caucasian, maybe 3% multiracial, less than 3% probably international and out of state, and then a few declines in states. But 89% students of color is there. We have 68% women. So we've got to be able to nurture some of those men. But that activity and helping to impact their mental health doesn't just begin on a university campus. Where it should begin is in the communities that these students come from.
Mm-hmm.
How do we then begin to partner with some of those entities that do that? So on my campus, we have, for example, a Male Success Alliance that you can see online.
Mm-hmm.
And those are some of the things probably that you're referring to, because that is particularly made to stand up some of the work we can specifically do with those men of color, because we know they need a little bit of added extra stuff. But early in my career, I'm a proud member of the National 100 Black Men of America.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a founding member of the Orange County chapter. So all those years I was in Irvine, we stood up the Orange County chapter that it ironically made chapter of the year a couple times within the whole 100 Black Men network. But we developed a Passport to the Future program that I now call the Bakari Project, that created a community intervention for young Black males to help them navigate the pathway to productivity and success, to try to get them college and university eligible, to help manage their mental health, and to help develop for them this kind of intellectual, emotional, and spiritual force field that can help them resist some of the crazy and the toxicity that goes on that they'll be exposed to in life, and still keep thriving and not be derailed by the crazy that goes on. So our goal at that point was to produce socially conscious, responsible, and respectable young Black men who could take advantage of life's opportunities and confront life's challenges with confident reassurance. And they've been running that program now. I'm not in the Orange County chapter anymore, that I'm up here in the LA County region, but that program is still running, and we've produced some life-changing experiences for young men who are just thriving now that might have otherwise been casualties had we not have made that particular interventions, and subsequently would have been struggling with some of the mental health issues around stress, anxiety, depression, et cetera, that are part and parcel of just growing up and living in society.
It's interesting on a number of levels. It's not that we, are post-pandemic, but there's a sense that things are returning, quote unquote, back to normal. And I wanted to get your perspective on the pandemic's toll in particular. Obviously, you being in academic leadership, it was a challenging time for many. I talked with community college leaders, for instance, and of course they talk about, how enrollment took a major dive. And so other leaders and everybody's had a different impact. I was wondering if you could talk about that impact. We talk about mental health, right? And, for me, I always wonder, what is the impact? We know the challenges that, we talk about Black students, talk about Black male students, what were some of the challenges that they had to go through specific to this pandemic? We talk about student success, and, I'm sorry for the long question, but we talk about the journey that Black students in particular had to go through to get to the door, right? To get to the door of an institution, only to be told in many instances, hey, pandemic is on and you need to go home, and different other things. I was wondering if you talk a little bit about where you sit with regards to the quote unquote post-pandemic space that we're in, and some of the moves that you had to make to support Black students through this pandemic journey in particular.
Complex question, but
Yeah.
I love these questions, by the way. You got like multiple parts, but let me see if I can dissect that one too. So let me start with the pandemic and the lessons that it taught us. A lot of pain, a lot of anxiety, a lot of hurt, a lot of death and transitions for loved ones that force people to come to grips with a different kind of definition of reality and what they were really looking for. And so it's forced people to rethink the way in which they want to live their life and how they pursue and what they pursue in the context of life's journey, which is sometimes what you see in terms of people deciding whether to work or not. Do they want to work remote? Do they want to spend more time with family? How do they put more balance in? Is a college education even worth it? And it's not like that conversation was happening, wasn't happening, I should say, before the pandemic. It was, but the pandemic just exacerbated it. So I'm clear about that. I think that, let me start with the health issue for a minute and why I think we were impacted. The people most impacted by the pandemic were principally Black and brown, probably poor Asian, poor white. Ironically, what did we do? The pandemic didn't come around the corner. COVID didn't say, it's some Black folk, let me go infect them. There's some Latinx brothers, there's some poor Asians, there's some poor white folk, let me go infect them. Disease is an equal opportunity employer. But what it did is attack the vulnerabilities that existed from the pre-existing health conditions that people were already struggling with before then. Mm-hmm. So if you put a pin, a marker and a map and draw zone and transition around those areas that are principally people of color and poor, what Derek Bell called those faces at the bottom of the well, people who live their lives at the margins of society, you'll find high incidence of hypertension, diabetes, poor nutrition, pulmonary disorders, heart disease, right? And so when you have those kind of conditions, those are the things that make you most vulnerable to the pandemic when it came along. So no wonder we were significantly impacted by that, by all of the pre-existing conditions that exist. My argument was, and I looked at my campus, I said, the time to teach a people how to be healthy is not when they're 50 struggling with a pandemic, but when they're 17 to 25 to 30 on my campus and campuses like mine across the country. But my campus was one of those that didn't have a health, wellness, and recreation center. Okay. So we have a student health center that physicians who treat folk, a psychological services center that treats people with mental health, run by a dynamic sister, by the way, Dr. Tiffany Herbert, a member of the National Association of Black Psychologists, by the way. But we didn't have a health, wellness, and recreation center, which is disgraceful for a campus in an urban environment where I'm trying to stand up what I think is a model urban university in the country. So I've appealed to the state legislature and appealed to other folk to say, what up with that? Why are we the only campus in this LA region that doesn't have one of those health, wellness, and recreation centers? So the Legislative Black Caucus, in the mind of State Senator Steve Bradford, heard us, as did the caucus, and provided us with a grant to be able to put a down payment on the health, wellness, and rec center. And then I went to the students. And I know you come out of this space to say we're poor, we're economically challenged. I get it, I grew up poor. But I don't want to hear about how poor we are. What I want to hear about is, what are you prepared to invest in your future? Because now that the state is ponied up, we're out here trying to raise philanthropic dollars. Students are going to have some skin in the game. You got to decide that you're going to vote for yourself to be able to build the rest of this facility. And the students end up passing a referendum to tax themselves a fee every year that'll create what is essentially $66 million over the lifetime of that building. So we're now building the 20 million grant from the state, the 66 from the students. We now have an $86 million building on the drawing board that we're drawing up and getting ready to break ground on in another year. That's a brand new health, wellness, and recreation center. So that's what we did. Academically, what we did is we did what everybody else had to do, is we had to pivot. And so we pivoted and said, we all got to be home until we better understand this COVID thing and what does it mean and what are the vulnerabilities and how do you develop immunity from it and are there vaccines available, none of which we had early on back in February and March of 20 when this thing was first starting to take root. And so what I did do is say, we had a couple buildings on campus we were starting to build. Everybody said, let's shut down because everybody got to be off campus. I went, no, time out. If nobody's going to be on campus, which they weren't, then we're not going to defer building. We're going to accelerate building because we can build it faster now and hopefully cheaper because they don't have to go through all the gyrations you have to do when you have to move around people to get it done. So we stood up a number of buildings that were there in COVID. But also, we said, let's pivot in COVID. And what got exposed in that was the digital divide.
Yep.
Because on campuses like mine that are under-resourced and have under-resourced and neglected for years, there 50% of my students didn't have devices.
Yep.
Or they're pulling up to places where there's maybe one computer at home, but now dad and mom got to use it for work, siblings got to use it for school, they got to use it for class. And that even assumes they have the bandwidth at home. Yep. To be able to allow it to work because they're used to running down the corner to the Starbucks to sit in their lobby and use their Wi-Fi to get a signal to get it done.
Yep.
Well, Starbucks has closed everything from, so it was hurting. So while everybody was prepared to pivot, we couldn't pivot in the same way. And so the opportunities to be able to do that were not available. So we had to spend money we didn't have. And I want to thank really the Biden-Harris administration and the federal government for the CARES funding that came along with the pandemic, because it allowed us to be able to purchase devices and equipment and upgrade some of the things that should have been upgraded long time before then to allow us to be able to allow us to be able to survive in the midst of that pandemic amid the digital divide that was so pronounced, I think, already there. But it reminds me, David, about this piece I've also said. Remember that the pandemic occurred not in isolation, but in the context of two other forces that were there. There was a financial crisis that was existing in the country then, if you remember. Mm-hmm. And there was a social justice crisis, not simply exacerbated by the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Philando Castile before them and Sandra Bland before them and all the folk that we've lost with these Black bodies, and a whole Black Lives Matter movement is there. So you have social justice and financial crises and COVID pandemic crisis. That's like what they call some stuff for your backside. I mean, that's a lot going on. Mm-hmm. That's a lot going on. Mm-hmm. So you wonder why people's mental health and other things are challenged. But I've said this. So the psychologist in me, crisis does three things. It reveals character. It certainly did in the last White House before Biden and Harris got in there. It exposes weakness. And lots of us got exposed about what are the weaknesses in our organizations. But it also creates opportunity. So what we tried to do was stand up character and see where character lied. What we tried to do was figure out how do we expose the weakness and then try to shore up some of the weaknesses that got exposed. And then how do we use crisis to create opportunity to be able to move on that? And so what I told folk very clearly is people say, well, how do we recover from the pandemic? I said, I'm not interested in recovering back to a doggone thing. Mm-hmm. Because psychologically, recovery assumes that what you're recovering back to was normal and healthy in the first place. Mm-hmm. What the exposure taught us is that there was nothing normal and healthy about being under-resourced. There was nothing normal and healthy about not having a health, wellness, and rec center. There was nothing normal and healthy about not having digital devices and internet access and that digital divide being pronounced. That's not normal and healthy. So what I said is we want to move back to transform the institution back to what it should have been all along, rather than sit and rest with where it had always been. I don't want to recover back to that. I want to transcend that and move beyond. And that's what we've been trying to do.
You know, my last question is with regards to the future at Dominguez Hills. You talked about, interestingly enough, accelerating capital projects, when, of course, the thinking was maybe it would be time to shut down and to retrench. You talked about, issues with regards to the digital divide that were exposed really with this pandemic. And as we've talked about, so many people have talked about, crises like the pandemic just exposed, underlying inequities and brought to light what the struggles that, many students were having. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the future for Dominguez Hills. You talked about the capital projects. Some of your people sent me a number of the initiatives that you are working on, be it, the Juneteenth symposium, the Black Student Success Chancellor Strategic Work Group. And so there are a number of initiatives that, of course, have been put into place to support if we're talking about Black student success in particular. And so, my last question is with regards to the future at Dominguez Hills. What are some of the things, first of all, that have been accomplished in your leadership that you could point to that are making a difference? If we talk about Black student success. And as you look to the future of Dominguez Hills, what are some of the things that you think yet have to be achieved that you'd like to see happen at Dominguez Hills?
So I'll try to be quick, but that's another long answer to the question. So let me start with.
I apologize.
No, don't apologize for that. This is what conversation do. This is what we do, getting together. So you talked about the kind of Juneteenth piece, and I want to underscore that for a moment because it's important. For the first time in the history of the California State University system, which, by the way, my university is one of 23 in the California State University system. It is the largest system of public higher education in all of America. So I love the fact that we take a backseat to nobody in the country around that, educating some 490,000 students every year. That's a bunch of people. And so my Dominguez Hills campus is one of those 23. Now, we stood up a Juneteenth symposium this year, last year in 22 for the first time. And as we wanted to celebrate Juneteenth in the most appropriate way, we didn't put on a 2-hour program, but in fact, a 2-day one. And the Juneteenth symposium was designed, one, to celebrate the Juneteenth holiday, but to not make it performative as much as we wanted to make it meaningful. And so what I said to folk in chairing, I volunteered to chair this year, and I had my vice president for student affairs, Dr. William Franklin, as the point with that, along with a broader committee from the chancellor's office, that if Juneteenth was going to have real meaning and not simply represent another programmatic initiative that we could feel good about, then our efforts had to follow and do things like, one, interrogate the biases and assumptions that people bring with them into academic spaces we occupy. We had to develop new and substantive programs that address the true needs of African descent students, faculty, and staff. And we had to examine the policies and practices that inhibit rather than facilitate the progress in supporting Black excellence in the largest system of public higher education in America. So over the 2 days, and I brought everybody in my book out, from Cornell West to Tyrone Howard to Sean Harper to Michelle Goodwin to, lots of folk, Dr. Juanita Watts, everybody was kind of at this place speaking across the 2 days. But I ended with myself, Chancellor Kester of our CSU system, and Shirley Weber, who was the Secretary of State and former state assembly down in San Diego. But I ended with a call, taking a piece off of Martin's book on where do we go from here. And you remember Martin, when he wrote that piece in 1967, if my memory is correct, he challenged us in the book with 4 or 5 things. And he said, in the midst of that where do we go from here piece, he said, first, we have to massively assert the dignity and worth of Black people. And it must stand up against systems that try to oppress them. Secondly, they had to discover how to really organize their strength into economic and political power. They had to reaffirm their commitment to nonviolence, which you remember was part of Martin's piece. Mm-hmm. But also he challenged the nation. He said, this is no time for a romantic illusion and empty philosophical debate about freedom and progress, because there was time for action and strategy to get past that. He said it had to address restructuring the whole of American society. And to come out of that text, that movement, King said, with a divine dissatisfaction about the way things were in the country then, so that people can move forward. So in the context of Brother Martin, I then used that symposium to say, how do we in the California State University, which I feel very proud to be a part of, challenge ourselves to do exactly the same thing? How do we assert massively the dignity and worth of African descent people? How can the trustees and the chancellor system and our campuses and presidents across the system do that for Black presence? Because we're the largest system of public higher education, but across the system, we're maybe 4% African-American students, which is insufficient if we're going to be the big kids on the block. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to facilitate an increase in a Black presence, both among students, faculty, and staff. We wanted them to be able to replace the romantic illusion of Black equality across the 23 campuses. We also said, how can they create a divine dissatisfaction with the way things were in higher education for Black students and come out with something more intentional in our efforts? And so that's what we tried to do. So that report you referenced that will be revealed probably within the next month or so. We've just finished it, and I co-chaired the subsequent committee that did the Black Student Success Work Group. We've now presented it to the Chancellor's office. They'll be looking at it, and it'll be published at some point in the next month or two, with a blueprint for how do we facilitate a greater Black presence and a greater sense of Black excellence within the context of the CSU system. So that's what we're trying to do relative to that. In terms of the where do we go from here and the future, and does it look bright? I'm excited about the possibilities, because the California State University system is one of those systems that is committed to providing access and a gateway and a door to opportunity for a broader swatch of the state citizenry, not just allowing us to engage in, the selectivity ratios about we're only admitting the top so-and-so. And that's true. I have 4.3 students on my campus, but I've got 2.5 students trying to do 3.0. So I love that. But we've also got to put a greater degree of congruence between what we preach in terms of wanting to facilitate student success and what we actually practice and what the data shows us. So we've got to have more intentionality around standing up programmatic initiatives that support not only Black students, but all marginalized students. We've got to raise more money to provide scholarships to take the burden of work off of the back. We've got to redo advising models that allow us to have more of a triage system that focus on those who need help most, not just doing folk in ritual functional fashion every day, because I saw X number of people a day, even though I'm not getting to the folk who need it the most. We've put mental health systems in place that allow folk to be able to provide both individual and group therapy, but also programmatic interventions and workshops around managing stress and cultural comfort zones, et cetera, to help students feel that they belong in places like that. And we've also created an air on the campus, particularly through our strategic plan on the Dominguez Hills campus, that has 5 core pillars. So we're talking about going far together. What's our going far together? We want thriving students. We expect thriving educators. Everybody on this campus is an educator, from the janitor to the president, to the faculty in the classroom. So a lot of the learning that ought to take place is not just in the 4 walls of the classroom, but in co-curricular learning opportunities that happen outside of those 4 walls. So whether you're the maintenance worker who just says, student, you can make it, keep hanging in there. They feel affirmed that they belong, right? I've even had a piece installed in our library that students traverse every day. So you want to know why they belong? Because they walk into that library and it says, "Good day, Toro citizen." Toros is our mascot. It says, "Good day, Toro citizen. I respect your humanity and I bear witness to your success." So that's the mantra that we want our students and staff and faculty really talking about. We've blown up advising models, put expanded mental health resources in place. We've stood up affinity centers to help our students create the cultural comfort zones. But I've actually challenged our faculty, beyond being thriving educators, that we want to create a culture of care. We want to provide equitable access, which is the 4th strand. And 5th, we want to be a pillar of the community. But I've challenged our faculty to say that I need you to stop renting success and instead own success. So I've created an analogy of what you would do with renting a car versus owning a car. You ever rented a car? We don't put gas in it. We don't wash it. We don't kick the tires. We don't check the oil. We don't do any of those things that we would do for something that we owned. Why? Because we don't have the same level of pride and satisfaction. So I want our faculty to not only have pride in the A's and B's these students are producing, but I want them to own those C's, the D's, the F's, and the withdrawals, because that is not just on a burden on the back of the students. It is an indictment of our instructional staff who haven't found a way to capture the genius that I'm convinced exists in our students, because I believe that they are those seeds of divinely inspired possibility we started this interview with.
Okay.
So those are the kind of things that we're doing. And so how am I feeling? I'm feeling bright and capable. Lastly, I'll say, when I came to the campus 5 years ago, there were like 4 goals. I wanted to look at student success and what we were doing, examine the strategic plan from way back when to see whether or not it was still current, But the final two is I wanted to change the image of Cal State University Dominguez Hills to the external community about what they could expect from us. So now we're on everybody's radar screen. In fact, in a couple of weeks, we have the Vice President of the United States coming here to co-sponsor with MTV a forum on mental health. So now Cal State University is on that radar screen. But also I had to challenge my people internally that I wanted them to unlock. So excuse the reference to me being a psychologist and an African-centered one at that. I wanted them to unlock the shackles of conceptual incarceration that keep them locked in the way things had always been, rather than dreaming about what was possible in the context of trying to be this model urban university that I was convinced we could become. And that's what people are now starting to see with new buildings. We're fully accredited with new accreditations coming from different academic departments. We're putting in new academic majors. We're raising more money. We are connecting more folk. We're getting more grants. We're being more research productive. Our enrollments are strong, even as we're having a little bit of a dip with COVID like everybody is. But almost everything we touch nowadays as a university are really coming up gold. And so I think the future is bright for both Cal State University Dominguez Hills and the California State University system as a whole that I'm proud to serve in. And that's really what higher education should really be focused on generally.
Well, Dr. P, I thank you so much for taking some time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to spend some time with me here on In the Margins. Much appreciated. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
It's my pleasure. And thank you again. And my best to all the work you do in diverse issues. Y'all keep doing that work. I keep my subscription on my desk regularly. I still like the print version and not just the electronic one because I'm one of them old school brothers. But thank you for the work you do. And I want to applaud you as I sign off, because real power, Wade Nobles reminds us, is the ability, right, to define reality and make other people respond to that definition as if it were their own. The power of really diverse issues in higher education is in your ability to define and frame the discourse and challenge people to think about higher education and diverse issues in ways that were different than they can find in some of the other periodicals that really chronicle what goes on in this higher education space. And we need to applaud and salute diverse issues in higher education for all the decades that you have been doing this work. And just know that as a humble president, I appreciate what y'all have done for years.
Dr. P, thank you so very much for saying that. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. God bless.
Thank you so much. Blessings.
Take care. Bye-bye.